Thank you. Thanks, Nick. And thanks to CEDA for having me up here on this incredible array of speakers. Always hard to follow our friend, we know Sarah from the US Study Centre, of course, and hard to follow her. And so I'm going to shade my remarks less on US domestic per se and more about international matters, but then I'm being followed by Peter Varghese, and so perhaps it's in both of our interests that I'm not following Peter, but Peter will follow me to clean up any misconceptions I leave about where the Australia-US relationship is at the moment. And of course, it's always great to be back in my hometown. It's good to get back here on a regular basis because the place is changing so damn fast. It's remarkable what's happened up here in the now 31 years since I left. So thank you. What I'll do is I'll talk less, as Sarah spoke about US domestic, I'll focus more on the Australia-US relationship and what's going on in that relationship at the moment as a consequence of the disruptor-in-chief and a few other big things that are going on in the region, and try and milk out what's of relevance here to Australia. And so this is a bit of signal, noise, parsing going on. And that's kind of our challenge at the US Study Centre. On any given day, we'll get an invite to go to Sky or whatever, desperate need for commentary on the tweet of the day. And our challenge has been to resist that, to put that to one side and try to stay focused on what's really going on and what's of relevance for Australia, Australian policymakers, Australian business, Australian households, and what's frankly garbage, chaff being released by the distractor-in-chief as well. And so that leads me to just point out, look, there are multiple faces to the Trump presidency, and Sarah gave us a great presentation of some of the more obvious ones that we were aware of. His disregard for a conventional presidential magnanimity, the non-stop garish self-promotion, the possible collusion with Russia, paying off porn stars, and on 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 it goes. On the other hand, the US economy is doing pretty well. Under Trump's watch, the US economy has grown above its long-term 3% growth rate. He is the beneficiary of a lot of hard yards done by the US economy under the Obama years, bringing unemployment down from a 10% high immediately post-GFC to now a number that's in the low 3%. And we still don't think that's what full employment in the US looks like. That labour force participation rates are steady, reversing some secular declines in those. Interestingly, not as many white men in the labour force as there used to be. It's a whole other story about that, and one of the deep pathologies in American society at the moment, of which there are many. The Trump tax cuts do get some of the credit for this jolt to the US economy that is not just in the equities markets, but is apparent in real growth and capital expenditure numbers all over the US economy. Trump, whatever you think about the feasibility of sustaining deficit spending at the level they are, the US in 2019, US year-on-year federal deficit will go up to above 4% of GDP, in fact probably mid-4s of GDP. That's a big number historically. Public debt in the US is now comfortably over 100% of GDP. The comparable number in Australia is about 47% of GDP. And the tax cuts were throwing a lot of fuel on the fire in the US, where there'd been a long period of growth following the GFC, and a lot of economists wondering, is that really sustainable? Right now, the answer seems to be, well, for the time being, yes. A lot of uncertainty, and that was reflected in the numbers about policy uncertainty we saw this morning about the future direction of the US economy. But Trump has to is owed some credit there. Some of it's by accident, frankly, some incompetence that Congress sensed a willing partner, Trump willing to get a deal done, and Congress piled on a lot of spending. part of the US government expenditures that I pay a lot of attention to, the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Health research money, are doing great. Doing absolutely fantastic. Trump wanted a big budget increase. Part of America First was making America a research powerhouse. And Congress met his budget request and threw a little more on for good measure. So for those of us in higher ed, there is money pouring through the research sector of the United States at the moment, and at a rate we haven't seen for a long time. And so that's just one aspect of actually many good news stories in the US at the moment, below the headline about Trump and don't get me wrong, I mean, about Trump, but you know, there's an awful lot else going on in the US that I think it's incumbent for Australian audiences to pay attention to. And one that we've spent a lot of time at the US Study Centre looking at, and I think, and why I'm going to just spend a couple of minutes on it, because I think it's of special relevance for this audience, is the energy story in the United States. The United States, while we weren't paying much attention, has become self-reliant with respect to energy. The United States, in the last 12 to 18 months, has become a net exporter of energy. And yes, it is true that Australia is now the world's largest, or soon will be next year, the world's largest exporter of LNG. But that's going to change in about 2024, where the United States will become the world's largest exporter of LNG. The gas revolution in the United States was quietly happening while we were watching other things around the world, but has been, in America's recovery from the GFC, the role of cheap energy cannot be understated. And the reason we learned about this at the United States Study Centre, we were interested in talking to firms, Australian firms, that had operations in both countries. And we discovered all sorts of amazing stats, that cumulatively, the two-way investment relationship between the two countries is 1.6 trillion Australian dollars. Right? 800 billion in from the US, cumulatively, the cumulative stock of investment, and 600 billion on the outbound, your super at work, a lot of it chasing yield over in the US. In the course of doing that, though, we were talking to firms, Australian firms, and one with the Brisbane presence, a company called Incitec Pivot, and they went, we're not spending any more money in Australia, we're going to the United States. And we said, why is that? They said, one word, energy. And it's the difference between $12 and $13 a gigajoule in Altona and Botany and Pinkenba versus $3 and $4 a gigajoule in Baton Rouge and New Orleans and Mobile, Alabama. And a can-do attitude from governors that want to beat the Louisiana governor, wants to beat the Mississippi governor, wants to beat the Alabama governor, this real can-do attitude to lock down these deals. Do not let the Aussies leave the room. They are signing those contracts today. And we're going to lock in $3 to $4 gigajoule for an energy-intensive business. And Incitec Pivot, fertilizers, nitrates, explosives, stuff like that. Huge energy input into their business. The Australian domestic conversation about energy at the moment is very much focused on households, and that's understandable given the election coming close. But missing in the conversation in Australia, I think, are the fate of big industrial users of energy, where it's chalk and cheese between the deals they can get in the United States and the deals they get in Australia, and the role that that plays in powering growth in the US economy, independently of Trump this or tax cut that. There is this structural, long-term strength in the US economy. They have unlocked gas. And it changes everything for America. It makes America first, by the way, a strategic reality for them if they choose to go down that road. They don't need the Middle East in a way that they may have needed them before. They may need them for other reasons, right? But the imperative energy security, that vests in the United States for the United States now. And by the way, is soon coming to Asia. Indeed, part of the deal that Trump and Xi are talking about is that China will take more energy imports out of the US as part of the mix of things they might want to agree on. No one would have thought that could be part of a US-China deal even 5-10 years ago. Remarkable how quickly that's happened, remarkable the extent of it. The other thing to say about gas is that it's a bridge fuel to a renewable future. Right now, the United States is beating Australia in greenhouse gas emissions per gigawatt of electricity generated. And it's not because 25 to 30% of American energy is produced by nuclear reactors, it's the gas story. CCGT in Australia accounts for single digits of our electricity generation stock. In the United States, that's close to 30%. Those CC gas turbines are getting ever more efficient and with respect to their greenhouse gas emissions and have really hit the sweet spot in terms of cost and their greenhouse footprint. And so, you know, Australia, we've gone down a different path. America said, thou shalt not export a single joule until we take care of our domestic requirements. Australia, we went down a different path. Certain Australian jurisdictions have said, thou shalt not drill. Right? And in American jurisdictions, the landowner has the mineral rights, not the state capital, not the state government. And a lot of small to medium landowners in the United States went, hey, let's go, that's mine. And just a different regime on two big structural things that are hard to unpick in Australia. But it seems to me that if you look at the American experience on energy, we have high labour costs more or less baked into the Australian social compact. We're not undoing that anytime soon. But could we give ourselves a leg up by exploiting cheap energy, another big input to a lot of businesses and what's left of a manufacturing sector in Australia? And so it's just one of the takeaways that meanwhile there's this show in DC that's horrible to look at most days, but meanwhile out in the States, there are parts of the US economy that are just powering, and literally powering, and cheap energy being part of the story. Similarly, out in the States, infrastructure. Now, Joe Hockey's our ambassador. He claims intellectual ownership of asset recycling. He's been preaching the gospel of triple Ps every chance he gets in DC, and the United States Study Centre, we accompanied what was at the time, and still is actually, only last year, the most senior delegation of political leaders ever to go to the United States from Australia. So the Prime Minister, Queensland Premier, New South Wales Premier, Victorian Premier, I'm going to forget some, two Chief Ministers and maybe another Premier went all together, and Hockey took with them IFM, Macquarie, Lend-Lease, QIC, all the names you know and love were well represented on this trip, essentially a trade show, trying to sell American, not the federal government, by the way. Where did they go? They went to the National Governors Association and are trying to do state to state, get Gladys talking to her counterpart from Kentucky, from Texas, from Indiana, on asset recycling. And it was remarkable to watch the vocabulary Australian premiers have for this stuff after a long history, lessons learned, both good and bad, around triple Ps and infrastructure provision with their American counterparts who are in a different world and are very reluctant to go down this road. There's great interest in this from Australian institutional investors, dying to do more in the US in this space, tremendous reticence from Americans who are, it's a bit of an irony here, in the land of the free, home of the brave, and low taxes. Once you pay your taxes, be damned, I'm paying a toll for the road. Didn't I pay? Isn't that what my taxes are for? So there's some real reticence about triple Ps in the US, but tremendous appetite from Australian institutional investors. And I've got to say, our ambassador, Joe Hockey, has done tireless work, but to not much yield at this point at least, in trying to promote that case and discovering that DC could actually be the last place you want to have an infrastructure conversation. Go have it out in Austin, Texas or Sacramento. The last topic I want to hit on is geopolitics. At a government-to-government level at the moment, between Australia and the United States, there's one word that animates the conversation. That word is China. Right? It's never, in my short experience in this role, but we have a remarkable sort of intimacy with people who are got carriage for the Australia-US relationship. The way that China enters into so many conversations between our two governments is remarkable. It's important for Australian audiences to understand the following. The change of tone in Washington with respect to China is not a Trump-specific phenomenon. The mode of execution is tariffs, right? And to hell with the WTO and all the rest of it. America first means we don't have to work through international institutions, and the allies will learn about it in their own good time, and we're going ahead and looking after our interests first. That mode of execution, right, and why are you doing tariffs if your real problem is intellectual property theft, right? It sort of didn't make sense to a lot of people. That's all very Trump-specific. But the strategic mindset that underlies it is not Trump-specific. It didn't matter who won the last presidential election. President Clinton would have a very tougher line on China than Obama and Secretary Kerry did. And indeed, there's a lot of pent-up frustration in DC about the conduct of China policy under Obama and Kerry. That's gone. Trump, in his own way, and the people around him, that cork is out of the bottle. And a lot of that pent-up, we have to do something about China sentiment in DC is now finding voice in the National Security Council, in Defence, in the State Department. And it is a, bit of a buzzword, whole of government priority for the United States at the moment. Members of our diplomatic team in Washington say China hasn't got a friend left in town. You want to find a friendly voice for China, go to Wall Street, but there isn't one left in DC. And I think that's right. It is across the political spectrum, it's across the think tank world. Anybody who's going to take a job in government, no matter who is president of the United States, has adopted this mindset that enough is enough is enough with the IP theft, and be damned if the United States is going to just walk quietly off the stage and hand the 21st century over to an authoritarian power, or at least enable them. We're not going to enable them in that. We're going to stick up for our values and offer. And that, okay, so why is that relevant to this audience? Because the Australian government, with a speed that Peter can perhaps speak to in a way that I'm sort of surprised by, has announced in rapid fire a number of initiatives, some of them joint with the Americans, some of them trilateral with the Japanese. All of a sudden we discovered the Pacific Islands again in a big hurry. And the pace with which initiatives were done, contracts were written for undersea cables to be laid here and there, the initiatives with Japan, the US on everything from infrastructure in the Indo-Pacific, public health, energy security, all of them, maybe they were in the works for a long time, Peter, at DVAT, but they seem to arrive in the public square very, very quickly. And part of a strategy of giving the region a choice. And with Australia unmistakably taking ownership of the regionally specific part, our neck of the woods. That is unmistakable. Now, if that makes life hard or harder for certain businesses, for vice-chancellors, get used to it. It's not going away anytime soon. I don't see any change in that policy mindset in DC, and nor particularly in Canberra, for that matter. Labor would occasionally levy a charge against the coalition that they've, quote, stuffed up the China relationship. I actually think they've been handling it pretty well. But get used to more of that. And it's called diplomacy. And it gets argy-bargy, and it gets awkward from time to time. But that's the world we're in. American canonical documents, their national security strategy and national defense strategy, for 9/11 to 2018, counterterrorism and counterinsurgency were our big priorities. We are back to an era of great power rivalry. And strategy does not come in things painted battleship grey. Strategy will arrive through a fibre optic cable, or the vectors of strategy, the instantiations of strategy, of national strategy and the projection of national power. And that mindset has very much taken hold in Washington and to some extent for Australians or certain people with carriage of our relationship with the US are very sort of read into that mindset that's coming out of DC. That's probably 15 minutes, so I'll leave it at that. But there's just a number of things to chew on as we think about what else is going on in America and what else is going on in the Australia-US bilateral at the moment. Thank you.